There is knowledge that the world does not actively teach you, not because it is false, not because it is without value, but because it is inconvenient for the systems and structures and people who benefit from your not having it. Because a man who understands certain things about the actual nature of power, of human motivation, of how decisions are really made and how influence really moves, and how the hierarchies you inhabit are actually maintained, is a man who is substantially harder to manage, harder to keep in place, harder to manipulate through the ordinary mechanisms that work so reliably on men who have never been given reason to look beneath the surface of things, and systems by their nature prefer manageable men, prefer the man who accepts the official account of how things work over the man who has taken the trouble to study how they actually work, prefer the man who channels his intelligence into the execution of other people's designs rather than the development of his own. Niccolò Machiavelli was declared dangerous for exactly this reason, not because he was cruel, though his readers who wanted him to be cruel found enough in him to construct that story, but because he was honest, because he looked at the world of human affairs with a precision and a willingness to name what he saw, that the conventional wisdom of his time, as of every time, preferred to leave unnamed. He wrote about power not as it should operate according to the moral frameworks that made people comfortable, but as it actually operated according to the evidence he had spent a lifetime accumulating. He described human nature not as the idealized version that flattering philosophy preferred, but as the complex, self-interested, fundamentally predictable reality that careful observation revealed. And in doing so, he gave every serious man who read him honestly something that the world had specifically declined to offer, a map of the actual terrain. Forbidden knowledge, in the sense this video explores, is not occult. It is not secret in the conspiratorial sense. It is hiding in plain sight, available to any man willing to look at things honestly rather than comfortably, willing to ask what is actually true rather than what is officially sanctioned. The reason it feels forbidden is not because access is restricted. It is because the act of genuinely acquiring it requires something that most men are never quite willing to pay: the cost of seeing clearly in a world that rewards and punishes selectively based on what you are willing to pretend not to see. And the man who pays that cost, who develops the genuine capacity to see what is actually there rather than what the room has agreed to acknowledge, is a man who operates from a fundamentally different and fundamentally more powerful position than the man who accepted the official version and never thought to question it. This video is about that knowledge, assembled from Machiavelli's most penetrating observations and from the Stoic and Jungian traditions that extend and complete what Machiavelli began. If you are ready to look at things as they are, you are in the right place. Please subscribe if this channel is where you come to build the kind of understanding that most men are never offered and most men never seek, because seeking it is the first act of a genuinely serious mind. The first forbidden knowledge: self-interest is the actual operating system. The official account of human motivation is generous and inspiring. People act from principle, from genuine care for others, from commitment to shared values and institutional loyalty, and the kind of altruism that puts the common good above personal advantage. And sometimes, in specific moments with specific people under specific conditions, they do. But as a general account of what actually drives human behavior at scale, in organizations and institutions and relationships and political structures, this account is not merely incomplete. It is strategically dangerous to believe it fully because it leaves you systematically unprepared for the actual forces operating in every environment you enter. Machiavelli's foundational observation, the one that runs beneath every strategic principle he articulated, was that men are primarily driven by self-interest. by the desire to secure their position, protect what they have, expand their influence, avoid the specific losses and humiliations they most fear, and obtain the specific recognition and resources they most desire. This is not a dark view of humanity, it is an accurate one, and the accuracy of it is not diminished by the fact that most people, most of the time, do not consciously experience themselves as primarily self-interested. The operation of self-interest does not require conscious awareness of itself to function. It operates through the lens of rationalization, through the machinery of unconscious preference, through the entirely human capacity to align one's genuine convictions with one's genuine interests and experience the alignment as principle rather than as convenience. The man who understands this does not become cynical. He does not stop caring about other people or stop believing that genuine generosity and genuine principle exist. He becomes accurate. He stops being surprised by the consistent pattern in which people's stated principles align with their actual interests. He stops being confused by the apparently inexplicable shifts in loyalty and commitment that attend shifts in power and advantage. He stops interpreting the ordinary mechanics of self-interested behavior as personal betrayal or as evidence of unusual moral failure. He sees them as predictable expressions of the actual operating system, and he factors that system into his understanding of every environment and every relationship he navigates. Marcus Aurelius practiced this with the discipline of a man who governed 100 million people and could not afford the luxury of being surprised by human nature. He wrote in his private journals about the necessity of seeing people as they actually are, not with contempt, not with the bitterness that can accompany disillusionment, but with the equanimity of a man who expected the actual human being rather than the idealized version, and was therefore never unduly shaken by the gap between them. He extended genuine goodwill to the people around him while maintaining clear sight about what was actually motivating their behavior. That combination of genuine goodwill and accurate perception is the only version of this knowledge worth building. The cynical version, which sees self-interest everywhere and uses that seeing as justification for one's own worst impulses, is not forbidden knowledge. It is ordinary bitterness dressed as sophistication. The practical implication is this: in any situation involving human beings, in any organization, negotiation, alliance, or relationship, ask honestly, what does each person in this situation stand to gain or protect? What outcome serves their actual interests, as opposed to the interests they have stated? Where does what they say they want diverge from what their behavior suggests they actually want? Those questions, asked consistently and answered honestly, provide more accurate predictive power about how people will behave than any amount of faith in their stated commitments. And the man who can predict behavior accurately is the man who is never genuinely surprised by it. And the man who is never genuinely surprised is the man who is always, at some level, prepared. The second forbidden knowledge, information asymmetry, is the real source of most advantage. Most of the advantages that appear to come from superior talent, or superior position, or superior resources are, when examined carefully, advantages of information, of knowing something that the other party does not know, of having access to context that changes the meaning of a situation in ways that are invisible to someone without that context, of understanding the full shape of a negotiation, a competitive landscape, a human dynamic, while the other party is working from an incomplete picture. The man with the more accurate and more complete picture almost always wins, regardless of how much talent or resource the man with the incomplete picture brings to the encounter. Machiavelli understood this as one of the central organizing facts of political and strategic life. The prince who does not know his territory, who does not know his enemy's actual capabilities and intentions, who does not understand the real allegiances of the men who claim to serve him, is not a prince who has been treated unfairly by fortune when things go wrong. He is a prince who lost the information contest before the strategic contest even began. The strategic contest is downstream of the information contest. It is decided, in most cases, before the moment of visible confrontation arrives, by the relative quality of the understanding each party brings to that moment. This principle operates at every scale. In your professional environment, the man who understands the actual power dynamics, who knows which alliances are real and which are performative, who understands what the decision-makers actually care about beneath what they officially prioritize, who has developed genuine insight into the real criteria by which outcomes are determined. That man consistently outperforms equally capable men who are working from the official account, not because he is more talented, because he is navigating the actual terrain rather than the map that was handed out at the entrance. In your relationships, the man who has developed genuine understanding of the people he is closest to, who knows what actually drives them, what they actually fear, what they actually need beneath what they say they need, that man can be genuinely useful to them in ways that the man working from surface understanding cannot, because he is responding to the actual person rather than the presented one. The acquisition of this knowledge is not passive. It requires the specific disciplines of genuine listening, of attending to what people reveal when they are not performing, of watching what behavior patterns persist beneath the variation of stated rationale, of asking questions whose purpose is genuine understanding rather than confirmation of existing assumption. It requires the discipline of updating your understanding when new information contradicts it, rather than filtering the new information to protect the existing model. And it requires the specific courage of being willing to know things that are inconvenient, that complicate the simple picture, that require action or adjustment, that the incomplete understanding allowed you to defer. Seneca wrote about the relationship between knowledge and preparation, about how the man who has taken the trouble to genuinely understand his circumstances is always better positioned than the man who preferred the comfort of partial understanding. He was writing about philosophy in its broadest sense, about the examined life as the life best equipped for whatever comes. But the principle maps exactly here. Know your terrain. Know it more completely and more honestly than the people you are navigating it alongside. And never mistake the comfort of the incomplete picture for the security of the accurate one. The third forbidden knowledge: the rules were made by people with interests, and they serve those interests. This is perhaps the most genuinely uncomfortable piece of knowledge on this list, because it requires a specific revision of something most men were taught to believe as children and have never been given sufficient reason to revise as adults. It requires the honest recognition that the rules of any system, the written ones and especially the unwritten ones, were not designed by neutral parties in service of universal human welfare. They were designed by specific people in specific positions with specific interests, and they reflect those interests in their structure far more reliably than they reflect any genuinely neutral principle. Machiavelli was explicit about this. He observed that new orders, new laws, new institutional arrangements are always designed by those who benefit from them and are always presented as serving the common good, not because the people who design them are necessarily dishonest about their own motivations. Often they have genuinely convinced themselves that what serves their interest is what serves the common good. But the alignment between those two things is never coincidental. And the man who cannot see it is the man who will consistently operate under constraints that exist not to protect him, but to protect the people who established them. This does not mean that all rules are illegitimate or that every institutional norm is purely predatory. The world is more complex than that, and many rules do serve genuine collective interests alongside the particular interests of those who made them. But the man who cannot distinguish between rules that genuinely serve the common good and rules that primarily serve the interests of the people who wrote them is the man who will never know which constraints to respect and which to examine more carefully, who will never understand which institutional norms reflect genuine wisdom and which reflect the preference of people in certain positions for keeping other people in different positions, who will follow every rule with equal deference, regardless of whose interests that rule actually serves, which is to say, who will be managed by the system in exactly the way the system was designed to manage him. The practical wisdom this knowledge generates is not anarchism. It is not the cynical conclusion that rules are for other people or that personal advantage justifies any behavior. The Stoics were clear about the obligation to live justly and to contribute to the genuine good of the community one inhabits. That obligation is real, but it is an obligation rooted in genuine principle, in the man's own considered judgment about what is right, rather than in reflexive compliance with any arrangement that presents itself with institutional authority. The man who has developed this distinction, who can look at a rule and ask honestly what it is actually for and who it actually serves, is the man who navigates systems with genuine intelligence rather than with the assumption that the system's account of itself is accurate and that deference to it is always the right response. Epictetus, who was literally owned by another man for the early portion of his life, understood better than most that the rules of any given system reflect the interests of whoever controls that system, and he built his entire philosophical framework around the recognition that genuine freedom, genuine power, genuine sovereignty over one's own life exists not in the rebellion against external rules, but in the internal clarity about what genuinely matters versus what merely has the authority of established arrangement. The man who has developed that internal clarity is not a rebel. He is something more dangerous to systems that prefer compliance, a man who thinks for himself. The fourth forbidden knowledge: most people are asleep inside their own lives. This is a different kind of knowledge than the ones we have discussed, because it is not primarily about external dynamics. It is about something internal, about the gap between the life being lived and the life being consciously inhabited. And understanding it has implications not only for how you navigate the people around you, but for the specific danger of becoming, without awareness, the very thing you are being warned about. Jung called it unconsciousness, and he meant it in a very specific sense, not the absence of waking awareness, but the absence of genuine self-knowledge, the condition of a man who is moving through his life, making his decisions, forming his relationships, pursuing his ambitions, all while being driven by forces he has never examined and cannot see, who experiences his compulsions as preferences and his wounds as values and his patterns as choices and his limitations as the objective shape of reality, who has never distinguished between what he genuinely wants and what his history has trained him to pursue, who has never asked whether the life he is building is the one he would build if he were actually conscious of the building. Machiavelli noted from his political observations that most men are moved by appearances and immediate sensation, rather than by careful analysis of their actual situation and genuine interests, that they respond to how things look rather than to what things are, that they can be managed consistently and at scale through the manipulation of their emotional states and their immediate perceptions without any need to engage their rational faculties, because their rational faculties are not substantially engaged in the navigation of their own lives. He was not contemptuous of this. He was observant. and his observation was accurate. The man who is genuinely awake inside his own life, who has done the honest and uncomfortable work of examining his patterns and his motivations and his actual versus stated values. He is a man who is operating from a fundamentally different position than the man who has not. Not because he has solved himself, because self-examination is a lifelong project with no terminus, but because his decisions are coming from genuine contact with his own actual nature rather than from the automatic operation of unexamined drives and inherited patterns and social programming he has never thought to question. He is harder to manipulate because the levers that work on the unconscious man, the levers of status anxiety and approval hunger, and the fear of social exclusion and the compulsive need to be seen in a certain way, have been identified and partially disarmed. They still exist, but he can see them, and seeing them, he has choice about whether to be moved by them. This knowledge is forbidden in the specific sense that acquiring it requires a confrontation with yourself that is genuinely uncomfortable, and that most men, given the choice between comfort and clarity, will choose comfort in the moment without fully accounting for what the accumulation of that choice costs over time. The man who refuses to examine himself does not thereby escape the consequences of what he has refused to examine. He simply loses the ability to choose what to do with it. And that loss is not neutral. It is the specific vulnerability through which every other manipulation finds its way in. The fifth forbidden knowledge. Leverage is everywhere, and you are either building it or ignoring it. Leverage in the Machiavellian sense is not only financial. It is not limited to the holdings and resources that generate economic power. It is any quality, relationship, capability, position, or asymmetry of information or dependency that gives you meaningful influence over outcomes that matter. And it is, in some form, available to every man in every situation. The question is never whether leverage exists. The question is whether you see it, whether you understand it, and whether you are deliberately building it or simply allowing what exists to remain undeveloped and unused. Machiavelli observed that the prince who relies on fortune alone for his security is always one turn of fortune away from having no security at all. Genuine security, the kind that persists when circumstances change and conditions shift, comes from having built genuine leverage, having established genuine capability that is valued and difficult to replace, having cultivated genuine relationships in which there is real mutual investment and real mutual benefit, having developed genuine resources, not only financial, that provide real alternatives when circumstances would otherwise force a choice between bad options, having positioned himself in such a way that other people's interests are aligned with his success, rather than indifferent to it or opposed to it. The specific forbidden dimension of this knowledge is the recognition that leverage building is always happening, whether you are conscious of it or not. Every relationship is either building mutual investment or draining it. Every skill either increases or decreases your capability relative to what is valued in your environment. Every decision about how to use your time is either building something that compounds or spending something that depletes. The man who is not conscious of this process is not exempt from it. He is subject to it without the benefit of directing it. And the man who is conscious of it, who understands that every ordinary day is a leverage-building opportunity or a leverage-squandering one, is the man who looks up years later at a position of genuine strength that feels, to everyone who did not watch it being assembled, like it arrived suddenly. The Stoics understood the internal dimension of leverage that Machiavelli's primarily external analysis sometimes underweights. The most durable leverage a man can build is the leverage of genuine character, of a reputation for reliability and integrity that makes every negotiation easier because the other party's uncertainty about who they are dealing with has already been resolved, of a quality of judgment that makes people seek your input before decisions rather than after, of a stability of presence under pressure that makes you the person others organize around when things get difficult rather than the person who requires managing during difficulty. These forms of leverage are built slowly and in private, and they compound without drama, and they are, ultimately, more durable than any external holding because they exist in the quality of the man rather than in the conditions surrounding him. The sixth forbidden knowledge, fear and desire, are the levers. Learn to see them without being moved by them. Machiavelli identified two forces as the primary movers of human behavior in every domain: fear and desire. Fear of loss, of humiliation, of exclusion, of poverty, of the specific forms of diminishment that each person's particular history has made most threatening, and desire for gain, for recognition, for connection, for power in whatever form each person's particular nature has made most compelling. Every significant human decision, when examined honestly and traced back to its actual source, is driven by some configuration of these two forces. The official explanation for the decision may be more elevated. The actual driver is almost always one or both of these. This knowledge is forbidden in the sense that it is uncomfortable to acknowledge in yourself and potentially inflammatory to discuss in relation to others, because it reduces the apparent complexity of human motivation to something that feels, in its simplicity, reductive. But it is not reductive, it is precise. The variation is not in whether fear and desire are operating, but in what specifically is feared and desired by each particular person, which varies enormously based on history and personality and circumstance. The man who can read those specific fears and specific desires in the people he is navigating, who can see what someone is actually moving toward and what they are actually moving away from beneath the surface of their stated intentions, has a quality of perception that makes almost everything in the domain of human affairs more legible. The internal dimension of this knowledge is where the genuine transformation lies, because the man who can see these forces operating in others, but has not examined how they operate in himself, is a man who has a dangerous blind spot. His own fears and desires are moving him in ways he cannot see and therefore cannot direct. His fear of specific forms of failure or humiliation is shaping his decisions in ways he experiences as rational analysis. His desire for specific forms of recognition or connection is driving his choices in ways he experiences as genuine preference. Until he has examined those forces in himself, named them honestly, understood the specific shape his particular history has given them, he is being operated by them at least as thoroughly as anyone he might observe being operated by theirs. Epictetus placed the examination and governance of one's own desires and fears at the absolute center of his philosophical project. He did not say that desire and fear should be eliminated. He said they should be examined and understood and subjected to the governing intelligence of the man who carries them, rather than being allowed to run loose through his choices and his behavior without his conscious engagement. The man who has done this work, who knows what he fears and why, and has examined whether the fear is responding to something actually proportional or to something that his history has distorted in scale, is substantially less manipulable through those fears. The lever still exists, but it requires far more force to move because the man can feel it being pushed rather than simply being moved by the pushing without awareness that it is happening. This is perhaps the most personally demanding knowledge in this entire video, because it requires the specific honesty of looking at the moments when you behaved in ways that you would prefer to understand as principled, and asking whether the behavior was actually more driven by fear or desire than the principled account would suggest. That question is uncomfortable. The answers are often uncomfortable. And the willingness to ask it and to receive honest answers is exactly what separates the man who is governing his life from the man whose life is governing him. The seventh forbidden knowledge: your potential is larger than your history. Here is where the forbidden knowledge turns entirely inward and becomes, in some ways, the most subversive of all, because the premise most men are operating from, the premise that determines the scope of what they attempt, and the scale of what they build, and the degree to which they take their own potential seriously as a real thing worth developing, is a premise assembled from evidence that is fundamentally backwards looking, from what has been tried and how it went, from what was attempted and what the environment returned in response, from the accumulated record of a specific history, in specific conditions with a specific level of development, meeting the specific range of challenges that happened to present themselves. And that record, however extensive and however honestly compiled, is not a ceiling, it is a floor. It is the baseline of a man who has not yet done the work of understanding what he actually is beneath what his history has revealed so far. Jung called the process of discovering this larger potential individuation, and he believed it was the fundamental work of the second half of a serious man's life. Not the construction of external position, though that is real and important. The progressive discovery of interior capacities that the persona has covered, the shadow has suppressed, the fear of failure has prevented from being tested, and the comfort of known capability has made it unnecessary to develop. The man who has not challenged himself consistently and honestly does not know what he is. He knows what he has demonstrated under the specific conditions he has encountered so far. Those are not the same thing. Machiavelli was interested in this at the level of political actors, in the men who found, in moments of genuine crisis and genuine demand, capabilities they had not known they possessed, who rose to what was required of them not because the crisis created new capability, but because it created conditions that forced the development and expression of capability that was always there but never previously demanded. He observed that men tend to discover the limits of what they can do only when circumstances require more than they have been producing, and he noted, with the characteristic precision of someone who had watched this dynamic repeat itself across centuries of recorded history, that those limits are almost always further out than the men themselves expected, that the human capacity for development, when the conditions genuinely demand it, and the man genuinely commits to meeting that demand, is larger than comfort suggests and smaller than fantasy promises. This knowledge is forbidden in the specific sense that acting on it requires the one thing that comfortable self-limitation most effectively prevents: the willingness to be tested in domains where the outcome is genuinely uncertain, where failure is a real possibility that cannot be prevented by careful management of the attempt, where what is required exceeds what has been demonstrated, and the gap must be closed through effort rather than through the confident deployment of established capability. That willingness is not recklessness. It is the specific courage of a man who has decided that the untested potential is more worth knowing about than the comfort of the already known is worth protecting. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, and nowhere is this more true than in the imagination of our own limits. The picture most men carry of what they are capable of is assembled from a deeply unrepresentative sample of evidence, from what was easy and what was hard, and what was attempted and what was avoided. And the most important evidence, the evidence of what happens when everything is genuinely demanded, When there is no comfortable option, when the only path forward requires more than has ever been produced, that evidence is almost entirely absent from the picture because the situations that would generate it have almost always been successfully avoided. The forbidden knowledge is this: you do not know what you are. You know what you have been willing to demand of yourself so far, and so far, for most men, has not been the genuine test. The eighth forbidden knowledge: the present moment is the only architecture worth building. This is the piece of forbidden knowledge that Machiavelli alone cannot provide, because it is not strategic. It belongs to the tradition that completes him, and it is forbidden in the sense that it runs directly against the orientation of a culture that lives almost entirely in the past and the future, while experiencing the present as the thin membrane between them, rather than as the only place where anything real ever actually happens. The Stoics were insistent about this to a degree that reads, in the modern context, as almost radical. Marcus Aurelius returned to it again and again in his private journals, not because he had forgotten it and needed reminding, but because the discipline of actually living in the present moment, of being genuinely in contact with the actual texture of one's own experience, rather than lost in the narrative of what has been or the projection of what will be, requires continuous recommitment. It is not a state that is arrived at and maintained. It is a practice that must be renewed in every moment that it lapses. The forbidden dimension of this knowledge is what it reveals about most of what men call their ambition and their planning and their strategic thinking. A significant portion of that activity is not actually strategic. It is avoidance. It is the use of future orientation as a mechanism for not being fully present to what is actually happening in the current moment of one's own life. The man who is always living in the next achievement, the next position, the next version of himself is a man who has found a sophisticated way to defer the honest encounter with his actual present experience. And his present experience, if he would stop long enough to make genuine contact with it, would tell him things about himself and his life that the continuous forward momentum of ambition as avoidance is specifically designed to prevent him from hearing. This is not an argument against ambition. It is an argument for the kind of ambition that is genuinely grounded in the present reality of a man who knows what he is and where he is and what his actual life actually consists of. The Stoics did not oppose building things. They opposed the psychological arrangement in which building things becomes the primary mechanism by which a man avoids fully inhabiting the life he is building. The present moment is where all genuine development occurs. It is where the shadow work happens, where the honest self-examination takes place, where the genuine effort is made and the genuine encounter with difficulty provides the resistance through which real strength is built. The future is where you imagine yourself transformed. The present is where the transformation either happens or doesn't. And the man who has learned to be genuinely present, to make full contact with the actual texture of his actual experience in the actual moment he is living, is the man who does not defer his development to a future version of himself that will never quite arrive, because the present version never quite committed to becoming him.